Hello everyone, my name is Khalil and the purpose of this video is to discuss the revolution in El Salvador. Here's a basic rundown of the events that I'm going to discuss in this video, and I know it seems like a lot of years, but I'm going to break it down to make it easier to digest. To really understand the ideas of this revolution, we first need to look at what occurred during the Spanish colonization of the area. Now, when the Spanish first came, these indigenous populations lived on the flatland that was very great for agriculture. And the Spanish wanted these lands, so they moved these indigenous populations to the less wanted, less usable volcanic slopes, and this is where these people built their communities. Now, once we get to the 19th century, around the 1870s and 1880s, we see a sort of coffee revolution. Now, one of El Salvador's main exports at the time is indigo, and with the creation of synthetic dyes, that threatens the income that can be obtained by this exportation. So many people look to coffee to satisfy these needs. Now, those lands that were considered less wanted and less desirable that those indigenous populations were moved to now became very valuable, as once those lands are terraced, they become perfect for coffee planting. Now, because these lands are now valuable, these lands are eventually sold off to coffee planters, and some of these deals were fair, and then some of them weren't. But what happened is these indigenous populations that once owned these lands now were working on these lands for little to nothing. So coffee becomes this big hit, it becomes this huge cash crop. In fact, coffee becomes 95% of the country's income, and you would think that'd be a good thing. However, it only benefited 2% of the population. So the small, wealthy group, the oligarchy of powerful families, the powerful elite, got all of the wealth from this, but the peasants, the poor, the people that were working received little to nothing. And this creates tensions between the poor peasants and the upper class because the lower class is starving while the rich are just getting richer. So tensions are growing and growing, and the Salvadoran Communist Party is growing in strength. And we have these communists, these Marxist, leftist, socialist, poor people basically wanting change in their government. So in 1932, we have Farabundo Martí forming the Central American Socialist Party, and he basically led the indigenous population, the peasants and the poor, against the government, which would lead to the slaughter in 1932. Basically, this slaughter crushed the chances of the Communist Party ever leading a major uprising against the government. The rebels killed about 100 people, and in retaliation, the government killed thousands and thousands of people. They killed people just for looking native or indigenous, and they killed people suspected of helping these rebels or helping the poor and the peasants. And at this time in this country, you see back-to-back coups, military-led regimes, and the poor in the country are just continuing to suffer. Revolutionary government junta overthrows the government. This anti-communist government basically gets support from the United States. Now, communism had been growing and growing in Latin American countries, and America was afraid of having another Cuba. So the Carter administration actually backs this new government. And this new government did promise to improve living for the poor and the peasants, and there actually was plans to have some sort of plan for land distribution, but this made the wealthy of the country very, very nervous, and they didn't like that at all, so they got rid of that plan. And this leads to the leftist guerrilla groups coming together to form the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or the FMLN. Another factor in the outbreak of the war was the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero. Now, originally, they thought of him to be safe, they thought of him to be conservative, but as conflict kept growing, it kind of influenced his perspective, especially when the government would send death squads that would target the poor and nuns. So what ended up happening was him coming out and speaking against the military, which the anti-communist government deemed very dangerous, and he basically became the voice for the voiceless. He used what's called liberation theology to support the poor and challenge the political systems that benefited from inequality. And what this does is basically combine the political philosophies of the communists and Marxists with the theology of salvation from the church, and creates this alliance between the Christians and the Marxists in El Salvador. Now, this form of Christian radicalism, known as liberation theology, was very popular in Latin America at this time, but it's also interesting to look at how the communists in Latin America were Christian, while primarily communists were thought to be atheists or against all religion. He was accused of mixing politics with faith, and he actually sent a letter to President Carter asking him not to aid the country in their human rights crimes. Sadly, Romero was murdered on March 24th, 1980, at the altar as he was celebrating Mass, and his death was really powerful as it sparked even more participation in the war. Here's a short clip from a film that was made in 1989 that shows his last sermon.
I'd like to make an appeal in a special way to the men in the army. Brothers, each one of you is one of us. We are the same people. The farmers and peasants that you kill are your own brothers and sisters. When you hear the words of a man telling you to kill, think instead in the words of God. Thou shalt not kill. No soldier is obliged to obey an order contrary to the law of God. In his name, and in the name of our tormented people who have suffered so much and whose laments cry out to heaven, I implore you, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression!
Now, it would be impossible to discuss the entirety of the war in such little time, so I'm going to break it down. On January 10th, 1981, the FMLN launched their first offensive. Now, they used non-traditional tactics because they didn't have the wealth or the resources that the government and the military had. So they used hit-and-run tactics, moving in the mountains and countrysides. They destroyed bridges, power lines, and even had war attacks on vehicles that moved throughout the territories that they claimed. And they were actually able to capture 1/3 of their territory. They also killed and kidnapped government officials.
For several years now, under two administrations, the United States has been increasing its defense of freedom in the Caribbean basin. And I can tell you tonight, democracy is beginning to take root in El Salvador, which until a short time ago knew only dictatorship. The new government is now delivering on its promises of democracy, reforms, and free elections. It wasn't easy, and there was resistance to many of the attempted reforms with assassinations of some of the reformers. Guerrilla bands and urban terrorists were portrayed in a worldwide propaganda campaign as freedom fighters, representative of the people. 10 days before I came into office, the guerrillas launched what they called a final offensive to overthrow the government. And their radio boasted that our new administration would be too late to prevent their victory. Well, they learned that democracy cannot be so easily defeated. President Carter did not hesitate. He authorized arms and munition to El Salvador. The guerrilla offensive failed, but not America's will.
The military, on the other hand, had support from the United States and the Reagan administration, and the United States provided them with economic aid, military aid, and helicopters. They had training from the U.S. military, and basically that helped keep the FMLN on the run. Actually, between 1980 and 1992, the U.S. provided over $8 billion to El Salvador, and this is like $1 million a day. They also had search and destroy missions, mass executions, and even a slaughtering at El Mozote. What happened in the town of El Mozote is absolutely tragic. Basically, an elite force of U.S. trained soldiers went in the town and killed hundreds as they had received intel that the town was being used as a guerrilla base. Now, eventually, these reports turned out to be false, as most of the families in this town actually most likely favored the government and the United States over the guerrilla fighters due to their recent conversion to evangelical Protestantism. These soldiers interrogated, tortured, and executed the men in the village. They raped and killed women and children as young as 10 years old, I read, were raped. And after these people were raped, they were murdering them with machine guns and slitting the throats of children and hanging them from trees and setting buildings on fire. So this is absolutely a very tragic event. So at several points, both sides tried to end the war, but the thing was, they didn't trust each other. So the government refused to attend FMLN peace talks, and the FMLN was afraid to participate in presidential elections because they were scared that the results would be changed to benefit the right-leaning people. Now, in 1989, the last national FMLN offensive lets them claim some territory in the cities, and the government, the military, retaliates by killing 6 Jesuit priests. And this actually ruins the government's reputation internationally and at home. So by 1990, the war is reaching a stalemate. Communism is collapsing throughout the world, basically the end of the Cold War. And in 1990, the United Nations start mediating peace agreements. Eventually, on January 16th, 1992, both sides signed the Chapultepec Peace Accords in Mexico City. The aftermath was very disturbing. Over 75,000 civilians died in the war. The United Nations Truth Commission found out that the government, this military-backed government, was responsible for 95% of the wartime atrocities. After the war, El Salvador went through a reduction of the armed forces, the disbandment of guerrilla groups. They did the United Nations Truth Commission, and then a national police force was established. Key things that I want you to take away from this video is 1. Inequality and the greed of the wealthy made the poor and leftists in El Salvador want to rise up against the oppressors. And 2. After the government was taken over by the junta, leftist groups joined forces to form the FMLN. And what I want you to remember for life is 1. Liberation theology helped bring about the alliance between Marxists and Christians to get rid of their oppressive government. And 2. The right-leaning, military-backed government fought against reform by killing and kidnapping anyone fighting for the poor with aid from the United States. Thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your semester.